Hello, and welcome back to the Dean and Ben Talk Tech podcast. This is episode 10, and welcome back, Benoit.
Yes, welcome to you. I hope you had a great summer.
Albeit,
Did we think we'd make it to episode 10?
I think we set ourselves a fairly undemanding target of doing it once a month. If we tried to do it once a week or fortnight, I don't think it would have lasted because of our schedules. But no, I'm glad. Congrats.
Yeah, I think it's a good landmark as well, and we'll celebrate the year in a couple of months. But I think number 10 is kind of a landmark. So what have you been up to?
It's actually been fairly quiet in terms of events over the summer, as you might expect. I'll talk a bit more about an event I ran myself in mid-July. I'll talk about that later. But really, I've been watching what's been going on, especially in the US, around 6G, spectrum, satellite. I published a report on satellite direct-to-device via SDL partners. But so I've been sort of watching evolution of SpaceX and AST and what's happening in Europe. But one thing that really caught my eye was an announcement from the US, and particularly the NTIA, which is the sort of federal arm of or rather the telecoms arm of the Department of Commerce, and also does stuff like federal spectrum for government and military. But they put out a thing called a call to action on 6G for leadership and security. And this is this sort of coalition they put together of, I think it was like 26 different countries, Europe, but also including South Korea and Canada, and even like markets like Philippines cropped up in it. But it's sort of a coalition of the willing, if you like, to make sure that there is wrong to call it Western, but a sort of US and European flavored approach to 6G standards, security. Yeah, there's clearly a sort of supply chain and vendor angle on this as well. And my sense is that this is sort of getting ahead of the curve a bit on the 6G cycle. I think the US was, if you remember going back 6-7 years ago, it was very keen to ensure or try to reduce the influence of Chinese vendors in 5G networks at the time. But they were a bit late to the game, and they found that firstly, a lot of operators had already contracted for their 5G infrastructure, but also there were lock-in dependencies with the 4G to 5G transition, meant that it was quite difficult to switch horses at that point anyway. And so I think that this is sort of US and sort of allies, and interestingly it includes Sweden and Finland, so implicitly European vendors, in trying to sort of make sure it's a bit different this time around.
But that's what I was going to ask, because I mean, really, if we look at vendor market shares, it's going to be very little is actually going to be US driven, right? So,
yeah.
So it's weird that they should take the lead on something where they don't have the kind of weight.
Well, there's a couple of things here to bear in mind. First off is Nokia and Ericsson are very heavily US centric these days in terms of, sales, profitability. They've both got huge domestic operations with manufacturing. I went to the Ericsson HQ last year, and there was lots of stars and stripes everywhere, as you'd imagine. The other thing is that as 6G is expected to be AI native, you see things like the NVIDIA investment in Nokia. There's this whole push around AI RAN. There's a sort of renewed interest in open RAN and disaggregated RAN, and there's projects like the funded what's called Okudu, which is the Open CUDU, which is partly driven by US military, but also a lot of interest in things like this integrated sensing part of 6G, obviously the integrated satellite part. So I think that whilst the US doesn't have big domestic radio manufacturers, the smaller ones like Airspan, and there's some people who do indoor and niche wireless systems, I think that this is why they're looking to perhaps be a bit more diplomatically aligned with Europe than they are on some technology issues. I'm putting that diplomatically myself.
Yeah, Yeah, it's interesting because in parallel to all of this, of course, the international political situation, even in tech, shows that the US is very aggressive on a lot of fronts. The one that I picked up on back in July was the US taking a very hard diplomatic stance towards Chile because, or Chile, I never know how to pronounce this, Chile, because they were considering a trans-Pacific cable directly from Chile to China, which would have meant that the normal US stranglehold on international cables was not viable. And similarly, when it comes to Trump's declarations on European tech policy, etc., it's not exactly
No,
collaborative.
I mean, I'm seeing in the US sort of different approaches to international engagement on tech, and I think that on the 6G side of things, there's clearly a real politique aspect. If you look at where the vendors are based, on the security, interoperability, standards involvement, and so on. There's a separate track around spectrum and how to get international alignment in advance of the World Radio Congress at the end of 2027. And there are some differences between US and Europe on things like 6 gigahertz band, on how we deal with satellite spectrum. I think that they've sort of kept that out of this call to action. And then there's separate things around subsea cables, certainly, and sovereignty, and also chips and semiconductors. And there's a separate international deal they have called Pax Silica, which I must admit I'm not fully up to speed on. But one of the interesting things I spotted, your comment about the overlap between politics and trade and international relations and technology, the Bangladesh trade deal that the US recently signed has an explicit carve out and mention of upper 6 gigahertz being unlicensed, which is unusual for Asia. And they put this in the trade deal along with sort of tariffs and trade in
Mm,
cheese and textiles, and now there's Wi-Fi in there as well.
that is, yeah, wow, okay. So we're going to have to broaden the spectrum of stuff we're looking at. So can you talk to NTIA versus FCC for a second? Because it seems to me that they are increasingly different in the way they approach things.
I think they have sort of different remits. I mean, certainly, I mean, I most encounter them on spectrum, and generally, FCC looks after commercial spectrum, which is pretty much things like cellular auctions and licenses, and an unlicensed for things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and increasingly also satellite communications as well. Whereas the NTIA is much more concerned with federal used spectrum, so that's things for the military, for things like aspects of aviation and other aspects of satellite. And there's this sort of double act where they split the responsibility, but also NTIA and FCC do other telecoms related activities, whether it's around the research side of things. With the current administration, the FCC gets heavily involved on some of the content issues, and then there's the sort of Treasury and other departments that look at some of the stuff around online taxes and treatment of big US tech companies. So it's a sort of White House plus agencies. It's not just FCC NTIA split,
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
certainly think the NTIA is probably more vocal about this sort of international collaboration on technology differences. I'm not
yeah.
sure if
Okay,
they're
yeah,
behind the Pax Silica, but it wouldn't be the FCC.
yeah. Also, I mean, my feel, and I've looked into that this week. My feel is that the FCC, maybe that was less true politically before Trump, but I think now is absolutely aligned. It's not a neutral agency in any way, shape, or form. And there was an interesting piece in the news last week, which is that they have now officially dropped their gigabit target for fixed broadband. So they had a like the official target is still 100 meg, um, but they had a kind of long-term, less formal target of a gigabit,
Hmm.
which I mean, if you compare to other international jurisdictions, is not particularly ambitious. but they've actually officially dropped that. And the excuse that was used by Chairman Carr, which I find completely bizarre, is saying, well, basically, because other technologies can't reach that, it was not technology neutral to state that target. But that to me is a pretty ridiculous assertion because
It, it
no,
is,
no, no,
but
no. Let me finish, and then you can disagree. But my point is that you're setting a target because you think it's needed or that it will deliver a better public good, not because you want to favor a technology over another. And in fact, you can deliver a gigabit with satellite or with wireless. It's just that it's a lot less cost effective to do it that way than to do it with fiber. And so arguing for tech neutrality and dropping that target when the rest of the world is already ahead of you in terms of deployment of gigabit speeds, um, I don't know. It is a bit weird, and it smacks of, Starlink is a friend.
um, it's an interesting one because I've actually often said for Europe the gigabit, it's a nice round number for a press release, but it's also completely arbitrary. Who
Oh,
decided
absolutely.
that a gig is better than or 700 or 1.3 gig? Where's it come from? It's basically a nice round
Yeah,
arbitrary
yeah.
number. And so, frankly, if you're going to pick arbitrary numbers and certain arbitrary numbers which are adequate for 99.9% of users, are inherently easier to make tech neutral. And I think there's a satellite angle and there's also an FWA angle. And
Yeah,
yes, I
yeah.
know you can
No,
get
no,
a
there is.
gigabit on 5G FWA, but it's, yeah, to my mind, I wrote an article on this a couple of years ago for with a European focus on it, and it was part of a series that I did, where I was looking at a bunch of sort of policy issues, with regulatory, advocacy agency, and I was like, well, actually, that makes a lot of sense. So, in principle, I mean, I'm not wedded to this idea of a gigabit, and I've long thought it was a bit arbitrary and unnecessary. So, if it's now,
Well,
on the other hand, you can see here there is a more specific one or two corporate levers that might be, have been pushing for this, but it's
so where I agree with you is that it is arbitrary. Of course, it's arbitrary. However, what's really interesting, and I've done a deep dive into this when we wrote our report last year for CCIA on the telco economy. Um, if you look at the numbers, you absolutely see that the moment the European Union switched from 100 to a gig, had immediate impact. Like literally the next year, the curves start going up in terms of deployment of gigabit capable technologies. So if you view these things as aspirational, you can't argue that they are useless because they have had positive results. Now, the the eternal question, which we're not going to tackle now, is do people actually need a gigabit in their daily lives? Blah blah blah. And I think actually that question is largely irrelevant because first of all, the speed number has become a proxy for a set of technologies that deliver more than just better speed, deliver better latency. They're also more stable. I mean, you know, fiber has been sold on speed for understandable reasons because it's the easiest thing to sell it on. But I actually happen to think that the benefits that it delivers to the digital economy are probably more, around sustainability, also ecological sustainability, even though that's a swear word in most politicians' mouths right now. Um, but also, yes, stability, just the general quality of experience beyond speed is just much better. Even if you subscribe to 100 meg on fiber, it's going to deliver a better and more stable service
uh,
than 100 meg on copper.
yeah, absolutely, and certainly the reliability and scope for lower latency. Absolutely agree, and no argument there. And satellite. and FWA typically are not as good on terms of latency, partly because of with satellite the
Yeah,
sort of round trip delay, depending on the orbit. Um, on the other hand, to my mind, this means that you can have the interesting argument is whether having one achievable arbitrary number is better than having a cutoff at 95% or 98% or whatever it is, where you go, okay, last few people who, I don't know, live on an island are a special case. So in fact, this means you could have
yeah.
one rule that covers everyone.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that's a lowest common denominator approach, and there's a point where you might then realize that it's insufficient in most places. I don't know. It's
Hmm.
as I said, we're not gonna
No.
tackle that one right now. But it's interesting because there's been a few other pieces in the news that are related to this kind of tension between satellite and
Oh.
fiber. And one of them, very interestingly, came from Poland, where basically Starlink has rejigged their tariffs, and most of their subscriptions in Poland have doubled in price overnight. And the Polish government and regulator were very pissed off and very vocal about this. But to some extent, to me, this is more of a competition issue than it is a technology issue. The issue is if you have, and I don't know, I'm pulling a number
Hmm.
out of my head here, but if you have 20% or 25% of the territory that is dependent on a single platform that you have virtually no regulatory oversight over, which is the case of Starlink, then you're opening yourself for this. And so, your own policy led you to this because you trusted a private actor who acts in its own interests and not in the interests of your economic development.
Here's a thought. Has anyone suggested that there could be the equivalent of loop unbundling and wholesale retail split for satellite?
I don't think so. I certainly have never heard of it. I don't imagine. Well, yeah, I think there'd be a couple of issues there, right? The first
Hmm.
one being which regulatory instruments do you have to actually impose that? But the second one would also have to be in absence of competition in the satellite field, and
Hmm.
presumably there will be competition down the line, but it's still very tentative right now. I'm talking about LEO. There are
Yeah.
other forms of satellite competition. Um, you know, I think Musk would rather pull out of a country entirely than subject his platform to unbundling.
Possibly. I mean, I'm now musing. I'm just wondering if it's something you could add into the MSS spectrum review. So, although yeah, this uses a different band. It's like KUKA, I think, for the broadband side of it rather than direct to device. But anyway, I might float that as a disruptive idea at
Yeah,
some point.
it
Yeah,
is an
wholesale.
interesting.
I mean, it's difficult with proprietary because then the question is, would a retail ISP still have to use the Starlink phased array terminals? Can or could they bring their own
Well,
terminal? That gets much harder.
there are different wholesale models, but many wholesale models have the equipment owned by the wholesaler. So
Yeah.
I don't see that as a major
Hmm.
issue. I mean, there's also economics that come into it, which is, we already kind of know that Starlink is operating at a loss structurally by design. So is there
Hmm.
actually margin for anything like that to happen? I mean, certainly if you were to float this, we'd need transparency on costs, which is definitely not the case with Starlink today. So
I'll
it's
part
an
that one.
interesting question. No, no, it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. The other thing I've been looking at, and I still need to do a deeper dive, but uh, as part of its annual State of the Internet report, ARCEP publishes a few months ahead what they call the Interconnection Barometer, which is just a slightly more in-depth piece that's focused on interconnection. And as I've said in the past, the RCEP report is certainly the most detailed that we have in Europe on interconnection. There's a really interesting Spanish report as well, but it doesn't quite go as deep. So I had a quick glance at the top level results, and the two things that I wanted to highlight, because I think especially the second one is very interesting, is that the first one is that incoming traffic growth follows the expected trend. So we've known it's slowed down for the last 7 or 8 years. Not the volumes of traffic, but the rate of growth. It's relatively stable in between last year and this year, so it's not slowed down. It was 9.5% last year, or 9.2, and it's 10.4 this year. So you could argue there's a slight growth there. We'd have to see down the line if that's just a dip or a bump, or if the long-term trend is changing. But I don't see right now why the long-term trend would be changing. The bit that I found really interesting, though, is that outgoing traffic, so upload, that is growing massively. So we have a plus 28% growth between last year and this year in Uplink traffic, and it was that rate of growth was 17% last year. So
and that's uplink measured where? Is that from on the access network into interconnect points, or is that from right? Okay, so and that does that also include enterprise as well as consumer?
Yes, it does, and that's what I find really interesting, because I had a conversation with ARCEP about what the causes for this might be, and my thesis is that actually the biggest driver is probably not people uploading TikTok videos in real time. It is a driver for sure, but I think the biggest driver is Microsoft 365 and all of those basically always online tools that everyone is using on a day-to-day basis, which might be a trickle of traffic individually, but globally, I think might be a really important source for that growth.
But I'm also wondering whether and this might be something in the definitions of the ARCEP report you could try and find, is whether normally when we talk about traffic, it is essentially retail, broadband, mobile, and fixed. This, if it's measured at the interconnect, probably also has things like the sort of SD-WAN and MPLS and Ethernet services for enterprise, like large enterprise, feeding into it. So if I'm taking a, I don't know, petabyte of data from my factory and uploading it to fine-tune a model somewhere else, does that get captured in this? Or is
I don't know.
other stats?
I'll have a look. I don't know if I'll be able to definitively answer that question, but I do think, however, that the route that the traffic takes is one of the questions that I have, because in theory there's a measure of the weight of peering and transit in there. So presumably even private peering gets captured, but that's where I have some questions about, not criticisms, but just questions about understanding the methodology, because ARCEP has quite broad powers of data collection related to interconnection, more so than other regulators in Europe, but I don't know how far that goes, and it's really something that's worth understanding better.
Because I'm now thinking about this and thinking, at the moment, whenever we get from a regulator talk about access networks, that's very much to a property, to a home or a business premise or something like that. But there's also another bit of access, which is private cloud to public cloud, or sort of on-site, what we used to call server rooms. So if you've got a factory or an airport or a R&D lab or something like that, you have a bunch of data either on-prem or maybe a small data center, and then you want to train a public AI model. So at some point it might not go over the public internet, so normally we talk about public internet as the mechanism, whereas there could be a direct peering between private cloud, public cloud, which is captured here. I don't know. I'm just
no. Well, and I don't think that we will have a definitive answer, but I think it's an interesting question to just get a sense of what the universe of what we measure is actually. So anyway,
Uh,
that's been on my mind, and it's something I will write about once I've delved in more depth. There are still, particularly in the way, like in the infographics and the way the data is shown, I think there's still some ambiguities, or at least things that are not immediately clear. The one thing I will say though, and that's really nice, is that there's a whole section at the beginning which is kind of interconnection for dummies, and
mm,
and I really wish it's very well written, very well done, and I really wish that the politicians who weigh in on this, like in the MEPs right now, that they would actually read this, because I think if they read and understood it, it would change the way they perceive these whole debates and discussions around the DNA.
indeed.
So yeah,
Right.
that's me. What have you got planned?
Right. Well, before I do that, just sort of very quick, I mentioned I ran this indoor wireless workshop in July in London, which had a mix of service providers, neutral hosts, regulators, other analysts and consultants involved. And it was looking at the importance of connectivity in building, whether that's cellular or Wi-Fi or wireless systems for microphones or industry or whatever. And there's a few that I'll put in the show notes, link to the full write-up I did, but there was a couple of things which really jumped out, and one was regulatory differences around the world and why, particularly in Europe, we need to get a bit more serious about indoor wireless. So in some parts of the world, like Saudi Arabia, if you're building a new building with more than 7 floors, you have to have multi-operator indoor cellular plus Wi-Fi. As part of the building construction permits.
Yeah.
And I think that regulators, firstly, they should be looking at best in class. Secondly, they should be asking for or obtaining better data of where is wireless currently indoors, where it's usable, is it multi-operator, this sort of thing. And there's a particular angle there which we explored around public safety, is can you use your phone to make an emergency call anywhere inside a building? So if you're in the concrete fire escape, which is where you're most likely to make a call to 112 or 999, is
Does it
there
actually
signal?
work?
Yeah,
Yeah.
does it work? I mean, that's an easy one to argue for. So I think there's some safety arguments. There's specific locations like hospitals where you want to make sure that everyone has connectivity, whether it's staff or professional medical visitors, consultants or ambulance drivers from another district, but also visitors and patients who aren't going to be fiddling with a Wi-Fi onboarding portal, and also just want their phones to work. So it's either going to be multi-operator cellular or auto-enrolled Wi-Fi using something like open roaming. And the last point that was really interesting was around whether we can turn neutral host shared infrastructure into an investable asset class similar to towers or fiber or data centers,
To
which
stimulate
would
private
stimulate
investment, basically.
exactly in infrastructure funds. So I'll put the link to the full write-up in the show notes.
Okay,
And then
excellent.
looking
That's
out for
really
the
good.
next,
Sorry,
go on.
just to add a bit here. I don't know if you know this, but now it's becoming less relevant in many countries. But for years now, there have been building regulations for fiber in new buildings in a lot of countries in Europe, and it has actually sped up fiber deployment, either by having fiber infrastructure pre-installed and a meet me point somewhere in the basement, or by having like forcing risers to be deployed everywhere so that anyone can very easily deploy fiber inside the building. So I think even from a kind of regulatory point of view, there are precedents here that could be good inspiration for something like this. I think that's a really interesting topic.
Hmm. Oh yeah, and extending from fiber in the building to wireless is
Should
definitely,
should
yeah.
be trivial.
You would think some parts of the world do it, and whether it's making sure that you've got an equipment room
Hmm.
for the gear you need to run neutral host. Yeah, I think Singapore is either Singapore or Hong Kong where you actually they make rules on must have make space available for an equipment room for
Yeah.
wireless indoor. So a couple of things that I'm working on, as well as my ongoing stuff around Spectrum and 6G and Wi-Fi and everything else. Two things I've talked before. I look a lot at the intersection of AI and voice and telephony, and I'm carrying on working on that. I'll be keynoting at an event for Alianza in the US in Scottsdale in September. I recently did a webinar report on AI voice for telcos for SMBs, not for large enterprises with big call centers and UC, but if you're a bakery or a hairdresser or an auto garage, can you use AI to front end your phone calls for out of hours and translation and transcription and all this stuff. So I'll also be looking in more depth at future of AI and voice, and there's a lot of opportunities and some challenges there. And that's a topic I'll be coming back to that in October. I'm running another Unthinkable Lab workshop on October 29th on AI and voice.
On a slightly lighter note, I don't know if you've seen or if you remember that comedy skit about the two Scots guys in an AI. Well, it wasn't called AI at the time, but a voice recognition elevator. And actually, that's just made the news a couple of weeks ago because a lot of MDs in the UK, doctors, have an AI system that's the same vendor, and it doesn't recognize regional accents. So a lot of people are actually speaking in English to it, and it doesn't understand what they're saying.
I've seen some solutions that do de-accenting, which I speculated about 15 years ago, and I've actually seen some demos, and we may actually be seeing some announcements on that. And the sort of imagine a Glaswegian talking to someone from South Africa, and you can having some sort of AI de-accenting. Now, interesting question of whether that counts as AI generated content, but I'll pop that one for now.
All right. Anyway,
Very last point. I'm about to launch something new on what I call post-digital futures. I'm going to be launching sort of website and newsletter, and it's going to be looking at photonic and quantum and advanced compute and communications tools around neuromorphic and in memory and all sorts of cool future stuff. So watch out for that.
Can you make sure it's understandable by stupid people like me? Or
I'll try. It's got some explainers. I've got some explainers already lined up.
All right. Well, I mean, I don't have a lot of big news. Basically, we're now entering the kind of home run stretch of the DNA discussion. So I'm expecting that's going to be a lot of my time, at least until December. I am looking into a few other things separate, but it's a bit too early to talk about them conclusively. So yeah, I mean, I do expect to be in Brussels and possibly in Strasbourg to some extent in the next few months. And I have no doubt there will be new things popping up that we can discuss on our next installment.
Definitely. Anyway, congrats once again on the 10th version of this, and speak to you soon.
Yeah, indeed. Bye, Dean.